We promised you another turn of phrase. Here it is. The turn of phrase this time is Mephistophelian. This has absolutely nothing to do with what we're talking about, but if you can drop that into conversation, people will at least raise eyebrows.
We're not going to tell you what it means. Look it up.
Yep. So, the question for Ian today, by the way, I'm Steve, he's Ian. We're here to talk about stuff. If you're watching this channel, you probably know what stuff we're talking about. But
it's an RPG we're making.
And if you don't know what stuff we're talking about, go back watch some of the earlier videos. You don't actually have to know what we're talking about to make sense of this one, though.
Go to our Patreon page and support it.
With this one, the question I'm going to ask Ian that he's going to try to answer in 5 minutes or less, and I will stop him at the end of 5 minutes if he starts to go over, is simple. Ian, in this game so far, we have been talking about trait-based resources, as traits are what define our characters.
That is correct.
How do we deal systematically with non-trait-based resources? And you may begin.
All right. So non-trait-based resources means things that the characters acquire that could be useful to them that are not written down on their character sheet as one of their traits. So the basic rule in the system for this is you can use stuff that is not a trait written down on your sheet to succeed in a situation where a challenge is called for once per session. And that is one of the things that you can refresh when you fail, because you can refresh an opportunity to succeed when you fail at something. So you could say, well, now I can use some of the other stuff I've got. Again, that is the basic rule. However, the non-trait-based resources also play a huge role in how the GM frames what should and shouldn't be a problem. Because if the players have access at the moment to gobs of cash, then the GM has to think about how they frame problems, because certain things that would be problem if you didn't have gobs of cash are not a problem if you do have gobs of cash. So the GM either has to make a problem with those gobs of cash, like, oh no, it turns out to be counterfeit, or they have to come up with different problems.
Here's a note, by the way. No matter how many gobs of cash the player characters have, even though it will make certain things not a problem, players can only say, by the way, I have gobs of cash, to directly deal with a problem once per game.
Yeah,
session. Once per game session.
Be it gobs of cash, be it having a car, be it whatever, the fact that you have the means to the end can only be the way that you succeed at the challenge once. But as the GM, you need to describe why having the stuff isn't enough. They need to have something more that lets them use the stuff properly when you frame the challenge. So let's say
there's the example I was asking for.
Obviously it needs an example. So let's say that you are trying to get from point A to point B, and for some reason there's a problem with this. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that you need to get there fast enough. And these 2 points are, see our earlier video about transit on Nuevo Paradiso and in the world. These 2 points are 2 points which you normally could not transit in that amount of time easily, so you're going to need a success. So if you haven't used your stuff success so far this session, you can just say, well, I've got this really cool car. It's a really neat ride. And you can just write it off as, I have a cool ride, that's my success.
When you have to get across town again later that session, you can't say, I've got a sweet ride, but you made it there in time this time.
Not only that, but once you get there, you've used up your stuff success, so once you get there, if you need to handle a challenge that involves paying somebody off, you're not going to be able to pay them off just because you have the money. You're going to need to convince them to accept the payoff. So, or somebody else is going to have the money and use their stuff success on it.
This might strike you as a somewhat arbitrary distinction, and you're right, it is.
On the level of the system, all the distinctions are arbitrary, and that goes right down to other systems that use dice. The dice are arbitrary. They are decided as the means to arbitrate the challenge, to take the arbitrary and apply it to the meaningful, and vice versa. So the last thing that I'm going to talk about is the sort of intersection of this with the traits on the character sheet, because a lot of these non-trait resources you actually could write down as a trait in some version. So what if the player thinks that the car is so core to the character concept that they've actually got sweet ride on their character sheet as a trait? Then that particular sweet ride, as long as it's not taken away from them, which, that's one of the problems of writing down sweet ride as a trait on your character sheet, is it could get wrecked. And then you can't use that trait until you get your sweet ride back.
However,
but
I'm going to point out, you might not be able to use that sweet ride as a trait to get you places, but you can use that trait as a remember my sweet ride. I'm
Sure.
the guy who had the...
And you would have lost it as a result of a specific failure, since that's a pretty big loss to you. But the point is that you can have these things as traits as well, and if you have it as a trait, then you have it as a trait and you have it as stuff. And you can use it as its trait success, and then you could use your stuff success through it as well in the same session and recharge either of those things when you fail.
And there we have it, how, in a nutshell, to deal with non-trait related resources and other stuff.
And we'll come back to you with more other stuff tomorrow.